All right. Yes, another hello to everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining today's event. My name is Peter van Beek. I'm the Director of Global Key Accounts at Semex. Before we will start, I will outline a couple of housekeeping items for today's session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type in the question box on the bottom of your screen. And we will bring them up and address them at the end of the presentation from Trevor. If you wish to view the presentation again, a recording of this session will be made available on the Semex website. And also you will be notified that the recording is available. So, now we're ready to start. You also notice that my colleague Mark Carson will join us. He's our one of our solution specialists, and he will be monitoring the questions once they come in, and make sure the right ones are grouped and addressed to at the end of the presentation. So we are very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, where we will be focusing on managing calves for best behavior, health, and growth. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Trevor DeVries. So Trevor is no stranger to the Semex webinar series. After speaking at one of the most watched webinars in 2020, where he discussed minimizing transition cow stress to optimize health and reproduction. Dr. Trevor DeVries is a professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Guelph. Trevor received his Bachelor in Agriculture from the University of British Columbia in 2001. Immediately after, following that, he began graduate studies at the UBC, where he received his PhD in 2006. Following that, he spent 1 year as a postdoctoral fellow with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And in 2007, he was appointed as faculty with the University of Guelph in the Department of Animal Biosciences. In that position, Trevor leads a highly productive research program focused on dairy cattle nutrition, management, behavior, and welfare. Trevor also contributes to teaching at the university, including instructing undergraduate and graduate courses in the areas of dairy cattle management, behavior, and welfare, and coaching the university dairy challenge team, as well monitoring of graduate and undergraduate students. So Trevor, welcome back to our webinar series. I'll turn over the presentation to you. So you can start.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to speak on this topic area of managing calves for best behavior, health, and growth. And what I'd like to do is walk you through particularly some research that our group's been involved with, as well as others, focused on early life management of calves, with the idea that what we do is not only going to impact them in the short term, but also have long-term repercussions from not only, again, a health and growth perspective, but also even a behavioral perspective. Now, in discussing health and growth of calves early on in life, we have to recognize that there are challenges associated with that, and goals, I guess I could say. And one of our challenges is a question of whether or not we meet our goals or our targets for those things. And so, again, these are numbers that I guess would be, quite common through the industry, but things like doubling birth weight by weaning, so at least weaning calves at, say, 80 to 90 kilograms of weight, having those animals grow at a rate which is going to allow us to have them large enough to be bred at, say, 12 to 14 months of age, and then keep that growth going so that they give birth, they get bred on time, they give birth at, say, 22 to 23 months of age, where they're at a large enough body size where they're going to give birth without challenge, and at the same time, not require yet excessive growth where they can put a lot of energy into milk production and have, obviously, a successful first lactation and beyond. and then stay healthy within that time period. And again, if you look at some of these numbers, what that requires from a growth perspective is very good, consistent growth. Looking at, on average, ideally probably close to about 1 kilogram of growth per day, particularly in the first 12 months of life, to really achieve some of those targets. And then, like I said before, stay healthy over that time period as well. Now, why are those things important? Well, I think we realize that not only is good growth and health important at the time, but there are long-term repercussions of these things. And there's some really good reviews done over the last number of years, and the two that I cite here already over 10 years old, suggesting that the performance of our calves when they hit lactation, so when they mature, is going to be particularly affected by things that happen to them early on in life. And so things like the amount of intake that they consume at the point that they're weaned, how many days those animals are sick in the first few months of life, how many treatments those animals receive, their overall growth rate during that time period, and then resultant body weight, all those things contribute to the lactational performance of those calves. So the greater growth, the greater intake, the fewer health events, treatments that those animals have to be succumbed to early on in life are going to have all positive impacts on the performance of those animals later on in life. The other challenge that we have, in addition to meeting those health and growth targets, is to also make sure our management practices promote good behavior in calves. And that's where a lot of the focus of our research has been over the last number of years. And there's two good reasons for that. And number one is it relates to what I was just talking about, and that's the fact that behavioral patterns in themselves can have immediate consequences on nutrient consumption and growth. And particularly, we know that, say, the feeding behavior of the animal dictates the feed consumption level of the animal. And so not only does that have immediate consequences for that animal in terms of the amount of feed that they consume and the growth resultant from that, and health, obviously, but we also know that those behavioral patterns are learned early on in the life of that animal. And they develop in relationship to or as a result of early life experience and management practices. And so we know that if those behavioral patterns are learned and they carry over, they may have long-term implications for those animals as well. And so that's what I'd like to actually talk a little bit about in relation to describing some of the challenges and opportunities we have in calf management early in life, is put that in the context of some of the effects that may have in terms of long-term behavioral development in those animals as well. The areas that are potential challenges or bottlenecks to our targets for health and growth and behavior are varied early on in life, and the list I've put together is not exhaustive, but captures mainly, or the primary kind of management things that we deal with when we think about calf management. So colostrum feeding, milk feeding level, weaning, solid feed consumption, particularly the type of that, and then the housing management of those animals as well. For the purposes of today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the last four aspects there. In respect of time, I don't have time to talk about colostrum feeding. We know that's important. It's hugely important, particularly from a health perspective. I don't want to diminish that, but we're going to focus on those four other points at this time, starting off with the milk feeding level of these calves. Now, when we think about feeding milk to calves, it's important for us to realize that obviously when that animal is born, it's born as a pseudomonogastric that really has a digestive system that's really only suited to digest milk. And so milk consumption as a mammal is hugely important for that animal early on in life. And it's only as that animal matures that the system adapts to be able to digest solid feeds, and the rumen develops, and the digestive system of that animal adapts and develops to be able to do that. That being said, for the first few weeks of life, probably up to at least the first month of life, that's really a critical time period for milk consumption, where we know that very little to no solid feed intake occurs. That animal, from a behavioral standpoint, is hardwired to want to consume milk, and so behaviorally highly motivated to do so. And so based on that, as well as a plethora of research that has gone into this, we know that in that time period particularly, calves need access to milk in sufficient quantities, and sufficient quantities to not only address their need for nutrients for growth and achieve the targets for growth that we have in those animals, but also achieve some of their behavioral requirements as well, or satisfy some of their behavioral motivations. And it doesn't matter, again, what type of system we're providing that within, or what type of method we're providing that to those animals, whether that's individually, with or without automation, etc. We need to ensure that those calves consume enough that they're going to achieve the growth and health and those outcomes that we want from them. And one of the things that we've learned over the years is that calves are capable of consuming high quantities. And I'd just like to highlight one example of that, just to demonstrate a few different things. And this is a study that we did almost 10 years ago already, comparing the consumption level of calves that had ad libitum unrestricted access to milk, as shown in the blue line, versus calves that were fed a restricted level of just over about 5 liters of milk, fluid milk per day, which would be typical of what was traditionally often offered in the industry twice a day, kind of milk feeding, 2 limited meals of milk. What you see, which is interesting in this graph, is that those calves that are provided ad libitum access consume a lot of milk already right quickly early on in life. So by 1 week of age, those animals are already consuming over 8 liters of milk per day, and they actually ramp up on average and plateau out here just over around 14 liters of milk per day. And what you see is they actually follow a similar pattern to what you'd expect in terms of a lactation curve of a cow, which probably makes sense because that lactation curve of the cow is really meant to feed that calf. And again, that cow produces more milk than what that calf needs in today's standards. However, that does show us that that would be a very natural progression, a rapid increase early on in life, and then a peak that's going to occur somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks of life, and then the start of weaning after that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here. But the point is that if we can get nutrients into those animals early on in life, they're highly motivated to consume milk during this early life period, we're going to see the benefits associated with that. Don't necessarily need to be feeding this much milk, and I'll come back to that in a second. But if we do get sufficient nutrients into those animals, we're going to see the benefits from a growth perspective. And there's no other way that we can get as good of growth out of those animals than by increasing their milk consumption early on in life. And in the case of this study, we saw almost a 20 kilogram difference in growth or body weight of those animals at the point of weaning and maintained beyond weaning in those as a result of those animals consuming greater quantities of nutrients from milk early on in life. And again, we'll talk about weaning in a few minutes. As long as we do a good job there, we're able to maintain that consistency. Now, question is, well, what are those benefits? We talked a little bit before already about some of the potential benefits there. There's, again, a lot of data to suggest that there's not only immediate but long-term benefits for these animals in terms of capturing greater growth of those animals, particularly greater growth through milk feeding early on in life. So things like lesser stress in those animals, improved immune function, actually improved efficiency of feed conversion after the point of weaning, earlier growth translating into earlier age at first breeding and potentially then earlier age at first calving. And then, as I mentioned before as well, improved lactational performance. Now, one of the other questions that we've had in relation to this is, do we also see then improvements in the behavioral or eating behavior patterns of these animals at the same time? And this was answered in that same study I just showed you, whereby in the case of this study, as I mentioned before, those calves that were fed low levels were fed in traditional 2 feedings per day, whereas those calves fed at a high level had continuous access to their milk. And not too surprising, those calves fed in 2 feedings per day consumed all their milk in 2 short meals in and around those times when feed was delivered or milk was delivered to them. Those calves with continuous access to their milk actually consumed larger meals in and around those time periods, which again, we tend to see. However, we also saw them consuming milk at various other time points of the day, which would be very natural for those animals. A calf that is left to, say, suckle with its mother would probably have anywhere from, say, 7 to 10 milk feeding meals per day. And so this type of continuous access would be conducive to that more natural feeding response in those animals. What was interesting about this data, though, was that when we looked at their solid feed consumption, we actually see that their solid feed consumption mimics their consumption patterns of their milk as well. And so those calves that were fed twice a day their milk in very small distinct meals centered the majority of their solid feed consumption in and around those milk meals, whereby those calves that were fed continuously or had continuous access to their milk actually, and it's hard to see because the level of consumption is quite low, actually had much more consistency in their solid feed consumption across the day. In fact, those calves with continuous access consume their milk at a slower, consume their solid feed at a slower rate in smaller meals with longer pauses while eating and with a lesser response to feed delivery. And for those animals at that time, potentially these behavioral effects may not have a huge impact on them or even their rumen environment. But we know from a lot of our work with adult cows that these types of feeding behavior patterns are conducive to better rumen health, better rumen efficiency, better digestion efficiency. And so this is an example whereby if we can promote this type of feeding pattern in these animals early on in life, this could carry over and have benefits to them later on in life. Now, a question that you might have is, well, how do we make this happen? Again, if we're feeding calves manually with bottles or buckets, that becomes much more of a challenge, and we have to think about getting those calves more meals per day. So increasing, say, for example, the number of feedings that we get into those calves per day. One of the opportunities that we have in the industry is the use of technology now, and this is where a lot of interest is from a calf feeding perspective, not only from a labor saving standpoint, but also from a behavioral standpoint. We can feed calves in a much more natural manner, whereby we can actually program these systems to allow calves to have multiple meals per day, not just 2 or 3 feedings per day, but 5, 6, 7, 8 meals per day, whereby that natural feeding response is going to be much more satisfied in those animals. From a target standpoint, and again, this isn't definitive, but my targets for milk feeding of calves would have them being fed ideally at least 8 liters per day, particularly within that first month of life. And then we can talk about weaning, and we'll do that in a moment, whereby we're getting at least about 1,000 to 1,200 grams of milk solids into those calves per day, or potentially more. And some of our research would suggest that calves can easily handle more than that, even 10 to 12 liters of milk per day. And as a result of that, we're going to see high growth and good health in those animals. And then related to the behavioral side of things, we want to ideally do that through optimizing the number of meals or feedings that those calves have per day as well. Let's say we get the milk feeding level of those animals right. The next question or next challenge that we have in calf management is successful weaning. And weaning becomes even more difficult as we do boost up the level of milk that we provide to our calves. One of the challenges that we have is that in nature, weaning for a calf should look something like this. I mentioned before how really the production cycle, the lactation curve of that cow is really designed and built to feed a calf. And we know that in nature, this is what weaning should look like for a calf. They should ramp up for the first couple months of life, their milk consumption, and then weaning would be a very long period of time after that. And that's what we would see if calves were kept with their mums, as we see commonly still, say, in the beef industry. Our challenge is that this is not the way that we typically feed calves in modern production systems. Rather, our milk consumption and weaning may often, in a lot of cases, look something like this. Or whereby calves are fed at a certain level of milk and then at a certain time point fairly abruptly removed from that milk source. And in some cases, it might look like something like this, whereby we might introduce some type of step-down weaning program. Now, our challenge is that in either of these cases, those animals are going to be receiving a certain level of nutrients from milk, and particularly energy, that's going to be feeding their maintenance requirements as well as their growth requirements at that time. And if we start to remove that milk, and at the same time, those animals have not matched their energy consumption with the level of solid feed that they're consuming, we're going to see a slump in the growth of those animals, whereby basically the amount of energy is not going to be matched, that they were receiving from milk is not matched by the energy that they would receive from their solid feed. And as a result of that, we see a short period of undernourishment. And that is quite common when we look at a lot of weaning programs. We see a short period of undernourishment whereby calves are not consuming and digesting sufficient quantities of solid feed to match the amount of milk that they were previously consuming. And as a result of that, we not only see a slowdown or even a slump in growth or a reduction in growth, but that reduction in nutrient consumption is also a stress on the body, whereby those calves, which are also incurring other stressors at that time, changes in feed, changing in environment, etc., are going to be more susceptible to health challenges as a result of that as well. And so to minimize the risk of some of those things, we need to make sure we try to keep that level of feed consumption and particularly nutrient consumption as stable across that time period as possible. And so our biggest challenge there becomes making sure that we're promoting good solid feed consumption in those animals across that time period. And so the four kind of areas that I'd like to kind of walk through, which I think again are probably the most important for us to think about, are how we reduce milk intake, when we time weaning, how or what calves are actually consuming from a solid feed perspective at that time, and then mention water consumption as well. So starting with the method of weaning, and I mentioned this already, if we're feeding calves at a certain level of milk and then suddenly remove that milk, what we're going to often see or nearly always see is some kind of growth check in those animals, whereby either their growth rates can be slowed or actually they're even going to lose weight during that time period due to a lack of nutrient intake. And that's really accentuated when the level of milk fed to those calves is higher. And this is a good example of that. This is a study from some Canadian colleagues from, again, over 10 years ago already, whereby these calves were fed a fairly high level of milk, approximately around 10 kilograms or liters of milk per day, up to the point of weaning here at 6 weeks of age, whereby they were abruptly removed, had their milk removed. And what you can see is that their grain consumption is very low. In fact, and I'll come back to this later as well, for these calves that are fed high levels of milk, there's really no onus or impetus for those animals to start consuming grain at any early point in life. And in the case of the study here, it's not till that milk is removed that we see the grains consumption start to take off. And it takes those calves over 10 days, almost 2 weeks, just to get up to 1 kilogram of grain consumption, which is clearly insufficient. As a result of that, we're not going to be able to sustain the growth of those animals through that time period. We contrast that, however, with a more gradual weaning, we see drastically different results. And this is a more recent study that we published last year, whereby we were looking at different types of gradual weaning programs. And what we observed was that it didn't really matter if we reduced milk consumption in a continuous fashion or used multiple steps to do so. But what was really important is the fact that we gradually reduced that milk consumption. And in the case of this study, again, feeding about 10 liters of milk per day, but rather than wean them abruptly, we wean them over a 2-week period of time on a gradual wean. And what you see, similar to before, very little solid feed consumption up to the point of weaning, but the minute we start reducing that milk intake, we see solid feed take off. And these calves are now consuming, in this case, 2 kilograms of solid feed at the point of weaning, which is a much more suitable consumption level for those animals in order for maintaining the growth of those animals through that weaning period and then beyond. And so the take home here is that we need to be implementing a gradual weaning program, ideally at least probably if we're in that 8 to 10 liters of milk consumption per day, a weaning program that's going to last at least about 2 weeks in time. And the higher that milk feeding level is, the longer that period should be, probably closer to 3 weeks, to really get them to increase their solid feed consumption to match the energy that they would have been consuming from milk over that time period. And again, our challenge within the industry is implementing this. If we're feeding calves individually by, again, bottles and buckets, this requires some creativity in terms of changing amounts that we feed, in terms of changing maybe the frequency of meals that we provide to those calves. But again, I think a lot of people are looking to technology again because of the opportunities that technology provides in terms of, say, programming these things on an individual calf basis and allowing us to do a good job in terms of stepping those calves down off the milk in a efficient and timely manner. Another simple way to actually encourage more solid feed intake in calves is actually to potentially wean them a little bit later. And something that we've seen in the dairy industry, which does change over time, is there was a move to wean calves earlier and earlier. And what we've realized that particularly, again, as we feed calves more milk solids or more milk in general, is that becomes much more difficult, particularly because, as I mentioned before, the motivation for those calves to consume solid feed is very little early on in life. And by pushing weaning a little bit later, we can gain quite a bit of extra intake into those animals from a solid feed perspective and see a much more smooth transition in those animals over weaning. And just a good example of that, this is from a study we published about 6 years ago now, whereby we are comparing calves weaned at either 6 weeks, so quite early, versus 8 weeks, which is a bit more standard. And what you see here is the milk, basically the energy consumption, so the metabolizable energy intake of the animals from milk, as represented here in this line here, which we stepped them down at 1 week prior to weaning off at 6 weeks, as well as the energy consumption from solid feed, whereby the colored line, the green line, represents the total metabolizable energy intake from both milk and solid feed. And what you see in these calves that are weaned at 6 weeks, they're fed a fairly good level of milk. And at the point where we drop them and step their milk down to initiate weaning, those calves are just not consuming enough solid feed to match that. And so we see this energy lag basically in those animals, and it takes them nearly a week after weaning just to get up to that pre-weaning level of energy consumption. If we contrast that to those calves that were weaned 2 weeks later, we see that at the point when now these calves are dropped down at 7 weeks of age rather than, say, at 5 weeks previously, that their natural inclination to actually start consuming solid feed has more so kicked in, which we typically see in calves probably past 4 weeks of age, but more close to around that 6 weeks of age of life. And so in this case, rather than seeing that drop, we see a little bit of a drop, but they still remain at that same level of kind of pre-weaning energy consumption, and they stay on a much more consistent trajectory after that. And so as a result of that, we see more consistent growth in those animals, whereby those calves that were weaned at 6 weeks, you can see here in the green line, you see them experience a lag in their growth at the point where they're weaned, as opposed to those animals weaned later. You see much more consistency through that weaning period. So that begs another question then, is when do we wean calves? And probably the simplest answer to that is to determine how much you want calves to grow after weaning. And again, that may sound vague, but really it comes back to how much solid feed you're interested in those animals consuming, because that's going to really dictate the amount of growth that we're going to see after weaning. And that solid feed consumption level of those calves is probably primarily going to be dictated by the age of those animals, and then some of those other factors that we're discussing here today as well. And just to support that, this is some data that was actually shared by Dr. Alex Bach, who's presented as part of this webinar series before as well. And the scatter graph shows the relationship between the amount of solid feed calves consumed before weaning and their growth rate in the week after weaning. And again, it's not a perfect relationship. There's quite a bit of variation around that, and we'd expect that. But there's a pretty solid trend line here, whereby the higher the level that solid feed intake is prior to weaning, the more growth we'll expect. And so if we're trying to target around 1 kilogram of growth per day in those animals, which is a good target for growth in and around that weaning period, we need to be looking at intake levels that are probably 1.5 to 2 kilograms of solid feed consumption in those animals at the time point when we're weaning them. Another factor related to weaning success is the type of solid feed that those calves consume in and around that time period. And we've long known that solid feed consumption is really what's going to drive the development of the rumen in those calves. It's going to help establish fermentation, which is going to then initiate the process of both the physical and metabolic development of that rumen. And so again, lots of good data suggests that we need a quality starter concentrate for those calves, which is going to promote the formation of volatile fatty acids, particularly butyrate, which is going to have a significant role in terms of papillae growth, development, absorption capacity. But then at the same time, what we've long known is that fiber and forage can also play a role, particularly in promoting the growth and development of the rumen wall muscle, as well as the volume of the rumen. Despite kind of long knowledge in this, our emphasis and focus in the dairy industry has always been on providing a good quality starter. And I think that still should remain. However, what we've learned in more recent times is that the inclusion of some physically effective fiber within the diet of calves can have significant benefits. And there's a growing number of publications and studies which have demonstrated those positive benefits. And some of that has included demonstrating greater solid feed consumption, both prior to and after weaning. And I'll make the point that solid feed consumption doesn't necessarily, or the increase doesn't necessarily come at the expense of the consumption of concentrate or grain. In fact, it should be additive to that. And so there's some benefit there. And probably the most interesting is that, and potentially even related to that, is the fact that we've also seen benefits from a rumen health environment, whereby the provision of physically effective forage or fiber early on in the life of those animals at weaning and through weaning actually has benefits to the rumen environment in terms of the papillae health, in terms of keeping rumen pH from dropping too low, and promoting greater rumen VFA absorption. And just a few of the studies I cited here, and a couple of the figures that were taken from those suggest and show that we see much improved papillae structure and form in those calves that receive some level of physical effective fiber in their diet early on in life. And we see improved evidence of that in these figures. And actually, our colleague, Dr. Alex Bach, who I mentioned previously, explains this phenomenon as actually the physically effective fiber having almost like a toothpick or toothbrush effect on the rumen wall, whereby it's actually helping, say, clean out some of that interpapillae space, removing some of the plaque that gets built up in that space, improving the papillae health, improving the absorption capacity of that rumen wall, allowing for greater kind of health of that, and then actually more nutrient transfer and better digestion efficiency as a result of that. And we have some evidence of that, some further evidence in actually a study that we did in collaboration. So both Dr. Bach's group and myself a number of years ago, whereby we were interested in looking at how that physical nature of forage within the diet of calves can play a role both in growth and behavior. And so what we did was we actually fed calves either a diet that was a mixture of 90% concentrate and 10% coarsely chopped grass hay, and it was chopped down to about 3 to 4 centimeters in length, as seen in this picture, actually, and it looks even a little bit shorter than that. Or we took that grass hay and we actually ground it and then mixed it with the concentrates. We ground it down fine to 2 millimeters. We fed the calves either of those two diets up to weaning, and then after weaning, we put them all on a common diet, which was a mixture of the coarsely chopped hay and their grain. And what we observed was that from a growth perspective, there was benefits of feeding the coarsely chopped hay. In fact, providing that physically effective forage improved the gain to feed ratio in those calves, their feed intake post-weaning, as well as their total tract nutrient digestibility post-weaning as well, likely related to some of those rumen health benefits I was mentioning before. What was also interesting is that we also saw behavioral differences between the calves on this study, whereby those calves that received the diet that had the coarsely chopped hay, they actually consumed a diet that was very similar to what we provided to them, whereby those calves that were fed the ground hay mixed in with their concentrate actually selected against that ground hay, the fiber in that, and sorted more for that concentrate. And so they ended up consuming a diet that was different than what we expected them to consume. And the interesting thing is that behavioral difference then persisted in those calves as we transitioned them all onto a common diet after weaning. And so after transition to a common ration at weeks 9 to 11 of life, we saw persistency in those behavioral differences, whereby those calves that were previously offered the diet, the mixed diet with the chopped hay, continued to eat a diet that was very close to predicted. So they consumed, where 100% is basically eating exactly as we predict, the level of NDF or hay in that diet that we predicted, as well as the level of non-fiber carbohydrates or concentrate in that diet as predicted. Whereby those calves that were previously offered the diet with the ground hay, even though they're fed the same diet as those other calves at this time point, sorted against the NDF or the hay portion of the diet and for the NFC portion of the diet. And so again, a clear example of how we induced not only a behavior, but a behavior that was learned and then persisted in those animals. And again, knowing that that sorting behavior becomes more and more of a negative behavior in those animals as they grow and develop, that's again an opportunity for us to learn and think about how we can prevent that from occurring in this first place in some of these animals. And so again, some best practices related to solid feed consumption in calves, providing a starter concentrate that's of high quality. And I think that's, again, first and foremost, we still have to do that. We still have to maintain that. High protein, ideally, to match the not only the energy, but the protein that those animals are going to be getting from their milk. And as they transition onto that solid diet, make sure it's, again, palatable. They want to consume it. But then consider the role of a forage source in that diet, either a poor quality grass hay or a cereal straw, with the idea that we're not necessarily including these to provide significant nutrients to those animals, but rather to provide some physical effectiveness in the rumen. It has to be chopped fine. I put there 2 to 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch length maximum. Anything longer than that, they're going to be able to sort, as well as it's just going to end up sitting in the rumen and not actually doing anything and just creating rumen fill and not actually pass by or through those calves. They don't necessarily need a lot. What our research and others would suggest is that we probably don't need pre-weaning to feed any more than about 5% of total dry matter intake, and so we should be limiting it to that. And so probably our best option there is to mix it with the grain at about 5% as fed basis, and so or dry matter basis, as those would be fairly equal, and feed a diet that looks potentially something like that. The other point that I wanted to make when it comes to weaning success and solid feed consumption in calves is not to forget about water. And I've had the comment many times that, oh yeah, we feed our calves lots of milk, so they're getting lots of liquid water from that, and so water consumption doesn't necessarily matter that much for those animals. But the point is that water consumption is hugely important from a solid feed intake perspective in those animals. And so if at any time point we're limiting water consumption in those animals, we might be limiting their solid feed consumption. And I just like to use this figure that comes again from one of our recent studies just to highlight the importance of this. And there's a couple things to notice. So this is the same figure I showed you earlier, but in this case I've added in this reddish kind of line here the water consumption of these animals. And what you see, a couple things to note here. Number one, it tracks nearly perfectly with the dry matter intake or the solid feed intake of these animals over this time period. And so again, as I was just mentioning, if we're at all at any time point, whether that's pre-weaning, weaning, or post-weaning, limiting this water consumption or water availability, we might be limiting how much solid feed those animals consume. So making sure there's always plenty of clean water in front of those animals is very important from that perspective. The other thing to note is that we still see, even though these calves were fed 8 to 10 liters of milk per day in the case of this study here, we see appreciable water consumption in those animals early on in life. And so it's not sufficient to just say, okay, they only need water when they start to consume solid feed. No, this would suggest to us that we need to make sure we're getting that water consumption into those animals, or at least the availability of that to them already in the first weeks of life, as they will start to consume that. And that's going to also help prime that rumen, help facilitate that dry matter consumption in those animals as well. Final thing that I want to touch on in relation to promoting better weaning and eating behavior in dairy calves is thinking about the housing management of these animals. And the one answer specifically to this question is what else may help is the idea that having calves eat with a friend or be in a social eating environment is going to have a positive impact. And again, there's been lots of discussion over the years in terms of optimal housing for calves. I realize in the industry, we still see the majority of our calves are individually housed in hutches or in individual pens. However, in recent times, the data would suggest, and particularly data over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, that there's more and more benefits to providing calves with the opportunity to live and eat in a social environment and have positive impacts as a result of that. And what we see very consistently in the literature is that grouping calves not only has positive kind of social impacts on those calves, even cognitive development improvement benefits for those animals, but it reduces stress and improves solid feed intake and growth through weaning. And again, this doesn't necessarily have to be large groups of animals like you see in the picture here. It can be actually as simple as just providing those calves with a partner or a pair. And that's where actually the majority of the research has been done on that level and would suggest to us that we see benefits from that. And As example of that, here's one study that we did a number of years ago, whereby we compared calves that were either individually housed from birth to the point of weaning here at 8 weeks of life, or we pair housed them from birth right to weaning, whereby then after all calves were pair housed. And what you see here is that these calves were all ad libitum fed milk. And so they had lots of access to milk, no real onus to start consuming solid feed until we started weaning them just past 6 weeks of life here. But what you see in those calves that were pair housed is that you start to see them consume solid feed earlier than those calves that were housed individually. In fact, they consume more solid feed through that weaning period as compared to those individually housed calves at that time point. And this is something that we see fairly consistently within the literature, whereby those calves learn about solid feed and start to consume solid feed earlier when they're housed in some type of social environment. And that then has positive impacts on their growth. And we've seen that in this study, whereby those calves that were pair housed maintain much more consistent growth over that weaning period, as opposed to those calves that were individually housed, which actually experienced a growth slump or a reduction in their growth rate during that weaning procedure, likely again related to the initiation or a consistency in their solid feed consumption. And as I mentioned before, that's likely that those calves that are socially housed are learning from each other and getting onto solid feed earlier as a result of that. And we see then carryover effects of some of those benefits as well. Some really interesting data that actually comes from the University of British Columbia, Dr. Joao Costa, during his PhD work, he actually observed similar kind of results, but instead of looking at the overall level of consumption, he was looking at their response of these calves to novel feeds and their adaptability to novel situations. In this case, feeding them either hay or carrots, which they had never been exposed to before. And what he observed is that those calves that were socially housed from birth, as opposed to those calves that were individually housed from birth, were much more adaptable to novel feeds and were more willing to consume these feeds that they had never seen before. And we see similar effects in other studies, whereby calves, say, that are transitioned from either individual to social housing after weaning take longer to adapt to a no social environment than those calves that, say, were previously housed in a social environment as well. And in the case of our study, what we observed is not only that increased level of intake, but we also saw a development and persistence of better eating patterns in those animals as well, whereby we saw not only improved meal frequency in those pair housed calves prior to weaning, but after weaning, when all calves were housed similarly, we saw a persistency of that eating behavior, which again, we know is a better eating pattern in those calves to see more meals per day. And we saw a learning of that and a persistency as a result of that housing method. So that gets me to the end of my presentation. Just a quick list of take-home messages that I wanted to share with you here today. If we want to ensure good growth and what I would say is a lifetime of both good behavior and production in our animals, we need to make sure, as mentioned, we provide sufficient milk to our calves, use some type of gradual weaning program, wean calves at an age that's going to optimize growth post-weaning, make sure calves eat a quality starter, but also consider the role of physically effective forage in the diet of those animals. Do not limit water intake in those calves, group house calves where possible. And then finally, something that I didn't talk about at length, but I wanted to make the point of at this time point, is to only introduce one stressor at a time, particularly in and around weaning, whereby those calves are often introduced to various stressors, feed changes, housing changes, maybe other management events, vaccinations, disbudding, these kind of things. And if we can avoid compounding those things together, we're going to see much more success and much better weaning transitions in those animals. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention and thank the various funders who made a lot of this work possible, and look forward to some discussion that we'll have on this topic area here today. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Trevor. I think it was, for a lot of good stuff and a lot of But I especially like those behavioral studies that actually are really confirming a lot of the theory that people know around the world, right? So it's great stuff. I've seen there's been quite some questions coming in. So anybody that still want to ask a question, you can still type your questions into the question box and send them to Mark. But Mark, the floor is yours, and bring up some of those questions that have come in.
Yeah, so thank you, Trevor. Thank you for another really interesting presentation. We've got lots of questions that have come in. Some of them I'm going to try to group together and summarize so we can get them to you at once. But to start off, what is a good target average daily gain for calves under 3 months? Like what would you target for average daily gain?
Yeah, good question. And I think if you go back to some of those targets that I talked about in terms of doubling birth weight by weaning, and then even getting those animals ready to be bred, like we have a push in the industry to have animals ready to be bred by, say, 12, 13 months of age. We can do that, but they need to be of appropriate size. And the appropriate size for those animals would be close to about, or to have at least a growth rate of, on average, about 1 kilogram of growth per day. And I would say that extends right to about the time of breeding. And so our most efficient growth is going to be early on in life. And so if we're targeting at least 1 kilogram of growth per day up to weaning or through weaning, that's where we're going to see not only kind of most long-term benefits, but also actually the most efficient growth. And so that's where we should really be targeting. We could probably reduce that down as we get beyond, I would say probably closer to 6 months of age, where we might drop that down between, say, 900 grams to 1,000 grams of growth per day. But in order to, again, to hit some of those targets by breeding age, we need to be hitting at least 1 kilogram of growth per day on average over those first few months of life.
Do you have know of any literature out there with Jersey calves and target how many liters of milk you can get into a Jersey calf a day? Is it different than Holstein, or have you seen any research on that front?
Yeah, I guess the literature is sparse. Again, we live in and from a research specific world, we're pretty Holstein centric. That goes with a lot of our mature animal research, but even our calf research tends to be very Holstein centric. And again, representing the majority of the industry, it's not surprising. Jersey calves obviously are smaller. And so probably, yeah, we are looking at levels that are slightly less. Again, I tend to look at kind of even the Holstein consumption levels on a percentage of body weight. So again, at least 20% of birth body weight. So that's kind of that 8 liters. And so again, if we can look at that from a Jersey calf perspective, we're probably looking at somewhere in that kind of 5.5 to 6 kilogram range as a minimum level of milk consumption in those animals.
Perfect. So in your opinion, Trevor, the better lactation performance we are seeing from the early development you're doing, is it through the improved growth rates you're seeing, or the better eating patterns that you're developing, the better that performance you're seeing in lactation? Are we training them better to be better cows in the barn, or is it the growth that we're getting?
Well, I think the answer is both, really. So we know there's some very good research to suggest that there's clear like epigenetic effects of that early life growth that we see, particularly in the first couple months of age, up to say 3-4 months of age, whereby we're seeing really some almost genetic programming that's going to be or allowing basically the animal to hit their genetic kind of potential more so, and we see that as direct result of that earlier growth, which is again going to be largely achieved through milk feeding, but again, it's going to be it's basically calories in to that animal that's going to be driving that at the end of the day. But at the same time, as I was mentioning, we do see behavioral programming, so to speak, and learning and development. And so some of these effects in terms of the eating patterns of the animals, the consistency by which they eat, what they consume from their diet, all of those things, I believe, compound early in the life of those animals and do shape the behavioral patterns of those animals later on in life as well. And so those are going to add to those things as well.
Very good. If there was no capacity limits on the calf rearing part of the operation at weaning, is 2 weeks optimal for the step down, or would you go longer?
I think it comes back to our targets for age at weaning and also the level of milk consumption. And I think I tried to allude to that a little bit in the presentation. Like if we're feeding, say, around 8 liters of fluid milk per day, probably about a 2-week minimum is required. If we're at over 10 liters, we're probably, based on kind of studies we've done, I've looked at in the literature and the effect we see kind of in growth slumps we see, we're probably looking at least 3 weeks, and we don't want to be weaning those animals before 8 weeks, but ideally probably closer to 9-10 weeks of age in those cases.
Awesome. One other comments come in. They said that there is other literature out there that they've seen. They've had their nutritionists say to them that feeding ad lib is less feed efficient. And that the calves come out the same weight after 4 months of age, regardless of ad lib or a controlled setting. What's your thoughts around that, Trevor?
Again, I would urge people to look carefully at literature and studies. In a lot of those cases, and I'm not necessarily an advocate of ad libitum feeding of calves. If people want to go that route, I think that's okay. I don't necessarily see it as completely needed, specifically if we're going to lengthen out maybe their rearing period a little bit, make sure we get sufficient milk, at least, like I said, that 8, potentially 10 liters into those calves in the first month of life. But going back to the question, when you look at a lot of those studies where you see kind of those, say, growth trajectories of those animals kind of come together, particularly soon after weaning, one of the things that you'll notice is just a poor job of weaning of those calves. And so either those calves, again, they were weaned too early, they were weaned too quickly, or there was other things that weren't done well with the weaning success of those animals. And so if you look at those lines, they're on a totally different trajectory. They hit weaning and either flatten out or they even do a nosedive. And so I'd be careful looking at that literature. The other thing that I'll make a point on is, even in some cases where we do see a good job, we do see those lines come together. And so there is a bit of what we call almost compensatory growth in those animals that may have been fed at a lower level early on in life. And again, I would argue that that's not ideal either. Our most efficient growth is actually in the first 2 months of life, and then beyond that, even the first 2 months after that, and then beyond 4 months of age, the efficiency of growth in calves really goes for a nosedive. And so our benefit would be to get that growth, and some of that long-term data would suggest that it's really that growth that occurs in the first couple months, which is most important for that long-term performance benefit that we're going to see.
Perfect. If you had your choice, there's two kind of a two-parter. If you had your choice, would it be hay or straw would you mix in with the diet? And if their calves are eating straw, if they're eating straw bedding, is that a sign that they need more fiber?
Yeah, so, well, good question. And yeah, at the end of the day, the work that's been done in the area of feeding kind of low nutritive forages to calves would suggest that we need basically a fiber source that's a high NDF source, low protein, that's really there, like I mentioned, to provide some physical effectiveness. So probably the most important thing is there. It's high fiber, it's low protein, it's chopped fine, not ground, but chopped fine, and then besides the two, I don't necessarily have a preference. I guess the only warning, or so to speak, is that if we provide a good quality forage, and that's where people have got in trouble, is that you see the calves actually prefer that. So if we put, say, chopped alfalfa forage in front of calves, sometimes they'll prefer to eat that over their concentrate, and that's not necessarily what we want them doing. We only want them to eat that in a very small amount, 5% or less of their total diet. And then to the other point is, yes, when we see kind of non-nutritive consumption of other things, including bedding, that's probably likely a sign that too, that we have some rumen imbalance that we need to address there. You see that even calves eating wood shavings sometimes, and we see that often with them consuming straw bedding as well. And so we could potentially satisfy that through the diet rather than things that may be in their environment.
Perfect. A couple questions that come in around this subject, and I think that we all got this pushback when we talk about increasing feed limits and as well as pair housing is one, how do you deal with pushback from producers who think that they're going to increase the diarrhea rate from going to a high nutrient diet? And two, group housing calves, producers push back a lot on that, saying that you're going to lead to a higher level of cross-suckling. So what are your thoughts on those two areas?
Yeah, both good questions. So on the diarrhea side, I guess there's 2 points to make. One is a true diarrhea that's viral or bacterial related is something that results from imbalance in terms of that animal, in terms of either too much infectious pressure on that animal or an inability of that animal to sustain or mount an immune response to that. And so if we have animals that are well fed, they have good colostrum feeding programs, they have a strong immune system, and we minimize the infectious pressure on that animal, clean environments, all those kind of things, we shouldn't see that type of diarrhea from occurring. Some people blame or talk about nutritional scours. Again, calves fed higher levels of milk will have a little bit higher level looser manure, but it's not necessarily a loose or bacterial viral type diarrhea. And in those cases, what we're often seeing is we're seeing like an imbalance in terms of the density or the solids content. And so if we try to feed, say, a milk that's too solids based, we'll see some level of imbalance in terms of the osmolality of that diet, and we'll see more basically water secretion from those animals and more evidence of that. And so my take home is we don't necessarily see more diarrhea. On the cross-sucking side of things, we have to realize that cross-sucking is a result of a few different factors. One is the amount of milk that the calves are provided. And number two is how they provide that milk. And so really, calves suck because that's their innate natural behavior for which they would naturally acquire milk from. And so we don't satisfy that sucking behavior when they're fed milk, they're going to push that behavior onto something else. In individual house calves, we see them suck on pen bars, we see them suck on buckets. When they're group housed, they do that on each other. And so if we feed them enough milk, we feed them through a nipple or a teat, right, that's going to satisfy that sucking behavior. They don't drink too fast. As well as we do a good job weaning those animals, we can eliminate that cross-sucking behavior from occurring. We will see the occasional evidence of that, but if we manage those factors that really kind of affect the sucking behavior of the calves, we don't necessarily see that in group housing environments.
Perfect. If so, for those out there that have automatic calf feeders, they want to know what would be the optimal amount of milk to be let down per session on one of those automatic feeder systems.
The amount of milk, like from a weaning perspective, or
it says maximize feedings per day. How much milk per feeding would be optimal for automatic systems? So
yeah, I guess in a lot of I guess it depends a little bit on the density of the animals on the system. For the most part, we typically see calves consuming in those systems anywhere from about 5 to 10 meals per day. And so the average kind of milk meal on those calves tends to come in between about 1 kilo to 2 kilos or liters of milk per milk feeder, or about 1.5 liters per. Again, some calves, we can ramp them up to higher levels than that. So again, kind of at peak consumption, probably consumption levels of about 2.5, even up to 3 liters per milk feeding meal.
Cool. Just a target. When would you weigh calves if you're going to weigh calves, Trevor? That's coming in a little bit here.
Yeah, and I think, well, that's something else we could talk about. Again, a lot of these growth targets are useless unless we actually are looking at them on farm. And I think as those involved as advisors in the industry see the value, right? Because we often don't even know how well of a job we're doing without some of those measurements. And so again, if we had weights on calves, obviously if we had birth weights on calves, we have say a weaning weight on calves, and then even a weight at say 4 months of age, and then again at breeding, that would be fantastic from a tracking standpoint. Again, comes back to the management of the farm. It's like anything, right? The more often you can do pretty well any management kind of event, the more benefit it can and may provide you in terms of data, as well as some of the outcomes associated with that. And so, but at minimum, I think even just tracking how well of a job we're doing in terms of the growth rates of those animals in the first couple months of life, and then even the sustained growth post-weaning is going to be very important.
Joel, just 2 more to sort of wrap it up here. You have, if you had a choice between a higher volume of milk, so if you're doing milk replacers, say, would you do higher liters of milk volume per feeding for higher feeding frequency, or would you do higher concentration of milk replacer for higher density, higher digestibility?
I guess I would err on providing more milk per feeding. Where we have seen challenges is when, as I was even mentioning before, when we try to push the concentration of say a milk replacer too high, we tend to end up with issues, right? So majority of milk replacers out there are designed to be mixed at 125 to 150 grams per liter, right? So that 12.5 to 15% kind of solids basis. When we push beyond that, we end up with trouble. What the data would suggest is that there was some indication at some point that maybe providing calves with big meals at individual time points could be negative. Some of the more recent work from actually one of my colleagues here at the University of Guelph, from Dr. Mike Steele's lab, would suggest that there aren't necessarily negative, kind of as big of negative implications of those things. So we can easily feed calves for even up to 5 liters of milk feeding if we had to. Ideally, I'd like to spread it over more, but if we had to, we could do that, and not necessarily, basically the benefits of getting that volume outweighs any kind of risks of that in an individual meal standpoint.
Awesome. So just wrapping it up here, for automatic feeders, how young would you introduce a calf to a group housing situation in an automatic feeder? And how fast would you expect it to ramp up to that 8 to 10 liters per day feeding range?
Yeah, good question. And we've actually done one study of this, and whereby we either introduce calves within a couple of days of life versus extending that out. And it comes back to, I would say, some preference, but the data overall would suggest that those calves actually do better if they're introduced earlier than if we wait. And actually, in separate studies, not necessarily with automated feeders, we actually see improvements the earlier calves are socially housed. And so I think our challenge would always be to try to do that as early as possible, but again, keeping within kind of the confines of the system we're in. So again, if we want to maybe, again, feed those animals some transition milk for a few days, get them well established in terms of sucking on a teat well, those are all probably good things. We may even consider a lot of what I see in those cases, producers who are even say caustic paste dehorning, despudding calves early on in life, getting that done, and then introducing them into that group house and that automated feeder after that.
Okay, I'll sneak one more question here. For farms that aren't big enough to or aren't set up for group feeding situation, but they want to have increased the meals per day, how would you do it going forward? So some many farms that may not have the group sizing to carry the automatic feeders, or just decide tomorrow they want to start to make some changes. What would you recommend?
And again, I threw the examples of the automated feeders in because again, they do provide lots of benefits from a labor standpoint, from automating some of those kind of good behavioral things we like, but realize that they still only encompass a small proportion of the industry at this point. The majority of people are feeding calves. Even calves that are pair housed, often they're feeding them individually, right? Or certain small groups, feeding them by bottles, etc. For those cases, yeah, you have to make a decision whether or not you feed them more often, and probably the standard in the industry has always been 2 feedings a day. If you can get that into 3 feedings per day, that's great. But beyond that, like we were mentioning before, if that's not physically kind of feasible, then just increasing the size of those individual meals is still going to have the dividends in terms of getting more nutrients into those animals.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevor. As always, interesting discussion around it. You've generated lots of questions. It's definitely calf rearing, and that, especially that transition period from through weaning, is a big interest to dairy producers out there. So thank you for the presentation. Really interesting.
No problem. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Trevor. Very interesting again, and lots of question and interaction. So before we wrap up, I would like to thank all the attendees for attending today and asking lots of good questions. But also I want to make you aware that we will have some upcoming public webinars very soon. So just before the proof run, we will have one on the changes of the net merit formula. So that's the total merit formula, the economic formula used in the US to rank bulls. It's going to be a very significant change, probably one of the most significant changes we have seen over the last year. So to learn more about that and the impact that will have on sire ranking and your selection, tune in on August 4th. And also after proofs, we will have an update on Friday, August the 13th. Hopefully we're gonna have luck that day, and we can bring you lots of good news about the Semex lineup moving forward. So you can register through www.semex.com/webinars. That's also where you can find recordings from previous webinars. And also I already want to make you aware that this fall we will get more those virtual farm tours from all over the world. So South Africa, Slovakia, Canada, and there will be some more to be announced soon. So we look forward to see you there. Thanks again, Trevor and Mark, for the help, and I wish you both a happy Canada Day tomorrow.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.